Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. We have some breaking news that's being reported by multiple MMA websites and reliable sources that I believe is factually incorrect and is completely worded the wrong way. And that is that Henry Cejudo has pulled out of his fight against Marlon Vera at UFC 292 in Boston in August. And I just believe that's factually incorrect. That is not worded the proper way. And I believe the UFC embarrassed themselves with this fight announcement. I believe the UFC is now pissed off after all this news and the way this situation played out. And I also, at the end of this video, there is another massive fight coming up in July on a pay-per-view that I believe will not happen because of similar circumstances to Henry Cejudo versus Marlon Vera, and we're going to discuss that at the end of the video. But starting off, the breaking news that's being reported, it's being plastered everywhere by the MMA media websites. Henry Cejudo pulls out with injury against Marlon Vera. He's no longer fighting at UFC 292. That is not correct. What that should read is Henry Cejudo unable to fight at UFC 292. Because what happens is, the UFC, and they've been known to do this for literally years since I've been watching the sport, they announce fights without even actually checking with fighters. They just announce fights, and the reason they do this is to put pressure on certain fighters. So if they go out there and they announce a fight, they say Henry Cejudo versus Marlon Vera at UFC 292, and then Henry Cejudo goes, well, wait a second, I'm injured, I can't fight at that. It puts the pressure on Henry Cejudo, or Henry Cejudo maybe didn't want to fight on that timeline, or maybe Marlon Vera is injured. He couldn't fight on that timeline. The UFC does this to essentially bully fighters into taking fights they don't want to take because of whatever reason it may be, an injury or whatnot. Now, when this was announced roughly 10 days ago, I talked about it. I said, you know, this fight may very well be off because the second that this fight was announced, Henry Cejudo came out and said, look, I'm injured. I don't know if I'm fighting Marlon Vera. I would like to fight Marlon Vera, but I don't know if I'm going to fight him because I have an injured shoulder because I just fought Aljamain Sterling in a 5-round fight last month. And the UFC, for whatever reason, they announced this fight anyway, even though the bout agreements were not signed because their fighters are not healthy. There are certain fighters that are healing from injuries. The UFC says, you know what, we love this matchup. Let's not call the fighter. Let's not call their manager. Let's just book it and we'll put it out in the news cycle. And then basically we can bully that fighter into taking that fight from the pressure of the fans. It'll not be a good look if they turn it down. And that's essentially what happened in this scenario. The UFC announced this fight. They didn't care whether or not Henry Cejudo was willing to accept it or he was 100%. And they just announced it. They went with it. And that was the end of it. Henry Cejudo put out a video as soon as this announcement came out, literally like an hour later, put out a video, look, I'm injured. I may be able to take the fight. I may not be able to take the fight, but I haven't formally accepted it yet. And then I guess something went on behind the scenes. Henry Cejudo deletes the video. Well, now he put out another video. He came out today. He said, basically, I am unable to fight. But I don't believe Henry Cejudo, and I know people are going to say it's just semantics. Henry Cejudo did not pull out of this fight. He was never 100% healthy to take this fight against Marlon Chito Vera. And actually, I'm happy that all this happened. I know some people are going to be bummed out. They're going to say, oh, I really wanted to see Cejudo versus Vera on UFC 292. UFC 292 was going to be stacked with this fight on it. I'm happy that this fight got canceled. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the UFC announced this fight prematurely just because they wanted to pressure Henry Cejudo into taking this fight at UFC 292. And it ended up backfiring on them because Henry Cejudo has a tear in his shoulder. He needs to recover. They just wanted to bully him into taking the fight. And now he comes out and says, look, there's no way I can take it. Because if you're injured, the risk versus the reward, if he goes out there at what, 36 years old, going on 37, and now he loses to Marlon Vera after he's coming off a loss to Aljamain Sterling because he goes in the fight injured, his career is on a massive downslope at that point in time at an advanced age in a division where you can't get that old. So the UFC just embarrassed themselves. They do this time and time again. It's a dirty negotiating tactic. They've been known to do this literally since I've been watching the sport. And I really do believe they embarrassed themselves because they set themselves up for failure at UFC 292. I did a reaction when this fight was initially announced. And I talked about this fight and I said the card was really big and I wanted an all Bantamweight card. But then I also did a live stream immediately after that. And I said, I think this fight's not going to happen. I think this fight is off because I saw the Henry Cejudo video after my video. And I said, I think this fight's canceled. A lot of people came into my live stream and said, this is clickbait. This title is clickbait and blah, blah, blah. Well, look at it now. It's officially not happening. Henry Cejudo is not able to accept the fight. He's not able to fight Marlon Chito Vera. And the UFC not only embarrassed themselves, I believe they're also pissed off now at Henry Cejudo. The UFC already doesn't like Henry Cejudo, in my opinion. I know they gave him the title fight against Aljamain Sterling, but Henry retired in 2020 as a negotiating tactic. The UFC was not fond of that. They moved on without it. Then Henry Cejudo only got the title shot at UFC 288 because Sean O'Malley wanted more time. So the UFC thought, okay, we don't really want Aljamain Sterling either. If Henry goes out there and beats him, at least we get rid of Aljamain Sterling. We get a new champion in Henry Cejudo, and then Cejudo can take on Sean O'Malley, and hopefully Sean O'Malley can be our savior. But what happened was Cejudo lost that fight. They booked Aljamain Sterling versus Sean O'Malley. They announced that fight before Aljamain Sterling agreed to it. And Aljamain Sterling is one of their champions. And Aljamain Sterling came out and said, I'm banged up. I don't know if I can fight in August. And Dana White said basically, well, tough luck. If you can't fight, we'll do an interim belt. How crazy is that? The fight's in mid-August. Aljamain Sterling fought for a title, defended his title in the beginning of May. 3 months apart, he wants Aljamain Sterling to defend his belt. That is craziness. That is not required of any other champion ever. And he's saying, I'm going to do an interim belt. So the UFC was going to bully Aljamain Sterling into taking that fight against Sean O'Malley on short notice, quick turnaround, have to cut a lot of weight. Meanwhile, Sean O'Malley's been preparing for Aljamain Sterling or Cejudo, very similar styles, since October after he won at UFC 280, where he got that brutal robbery win over Petr Yan. Should have lost 30-27. Somehow, the judges' scorecards give Sean O'Malley the win. But anyway, the UFC, and I talked about this in my original video, the UFC was using Henry Cejudo versus Marlon Chito Vera as a backup plan because there is a chance that Aljamain Sterling still pulls out of this fight. If he's too injured, if he's too banged up, he goes into training camp, maybe injures himself a little bit worse, and he pulls out of this matchup, the UFC wanted an easy replacement. So what they wanted was they wanted to have Henry Cejudo on that card. Henry Cejudo, I know he's not identical to Aljamain Sterling, but Henry Cejudo, very good wrestler, decent striker, stocky guy, strong guy in the clinch. Similar style, similar skill set. Obviously, I think Cejudo may be a little bit better striker. You know, Aljamain Sterling, way better jiu-jitsu and way better top game and way better, ability to get people's back and submit them. But in a way, it was similar enough where if Aljamain Sterling pulled out of this fight against Sean O'Malley at UFC 292, the UFC could give Henry Cejudo a title shot. Not because they like him, but just because they wanted to give Sean O'Malley a similar skill set in that potential interim bantamweight title fight. And now they don't have that backup plan. So I believe they're even more pissed off at Henry Cejudo for pulling out of this fight. The UFC and Dana White do not care about the health and safety of their fighters. They just care about filling fight cards. They just care about their contractual obligation to ESPN. So I think right now, do I think they're the most pissed off they've ever been? No. I don't think they're that fumed like Dana White when John Jones refused to fight on UFC 151 against Chael Sonnen. I don't think Dana White's that mad where he's going to go nuclear. But I think he's pissed off Henry Cejudo is not in this fight. And we're going to talk about what matchups I think they might make in case of a catastrophe in a second. But I think they are genuinely mad that they couldn't force Henry Cejudo into taking this fight because Henry said, you know what, I'm just not 100% yet. I don't want to take this fight. I'd rather sit out and wait for another opponent. Now, what do I think the UFC does in the meantime? I think the UFC has enough bantamweight fights on that card, whether it be Song Yadong versus Rob Font, Cody Garbrandt versus Mario Batista. I genuinely believe because the UFC wants to put on a big card in Boston, they're going to want to keep that bantamweight title fight in the main event. They're going to want to keep Sean O'Malley in the main event. So my guess is if Aljamain Sterling pulls out, I think they're probably going to sub in maybe Rob Font or his opponent. If Rob Font or Song Yadong potentially step in there, at least it saves the card. But I also have another option because now you have Marlon Vera without an opponent on this card. Marlon Vera said, I want to fight at UFC 292. I don't care who I end up fighting. What if the UFC did Petr Yan versus Marlon Chito Vera? Now, don't get me wrong. Regardless of when it happens, I want Petr Yan versus Marlon Vera. That's a banger of a fight. Absolutely would love to see that matchup. I think the UFC may very well book that for UFC 292. And if Aljamain Sterling pulls out, I would love this. I know people are going to call me crazy because Petr Yan's on a losing skid. I would love to see Petr Yan slide into that main event spot and fight for an interim title. Now, I don't want the interim title at all, but I know the UFC is going to keep it there. They're going to put an interim title on the line if Aljamain Sterling pulls out. I want Petr Yan in that spot. He deserves a rematch against Sean O'Malley. I mean, we don't really need to see it because he already beat him, but because he got robbed in that fight, I want to see that rematch. Plus, that was a great fight. Regardless of what you think of the judges' scorecards, that was an amazing fight. And Petr Yan, I know people are going to say, oh, he's on this long losing skid. He's on a 4-fight losing skid. In my opinion, Petr Yan has lost one fight. The DQ, I get it. He technically lost, but he was winning the fight. The second fight against Aljamain Sterling was razor close. I scored it for Petr Yan. It could have went either way. The fight against Sean O'Malley was a brutal robbery. The only actual fight he lost was against Merab Dvalishvili. And Merab was just pushing the pace on him. I mean, it wasn't like, I know technically he lost the majority of the fight, but it wasn't like, he was so bad. It was just Merab just constantly spamming takedowns. So even though Merab looked incredible and was just able to put the pace on him, I wouldn't have a problem with Petr Yan fighting for an interim title fight against Sean O'Malley. And then if he beats Sean O'Malley and doesn't get robbed on the scorecards at UFC 292, then Petr Yan gets that trilogy fight with Aljamain Sterling. And I would absolutely love to see that matchup. And I feel like if we never see that fight, I feel like it's kind of a tragedy in the MMA landscape. I need to see that trilogy eventually just because of how that whole series played out. But I think their UFC could really do that. And I think regardless if that's the actual scenario they go with, if there is in fact a pullout, which I hope there's not in the main event, I think the UFC will do Petr Yan versus Marlon Vera. I think that makes perfect sense. Now, as far as the bantamweight division as a whole, because now we have a lot of moving pieces, because if Aljamain Sterling beats Sean O'Malley, he may very well vacate the belt and move up to 145 because one of his best friends and training partners is sitting at number 1 in Merab Dvalishvili. Now, Henry Cejudo has said, I want to wait until I'm 100%, which isn't going to be that much longer after UFC 292. He says, look, I need to sit out for about 8 weeks, and then I can get back to training. So we're looking at like 4 or 5 months down the line. Well, Merab just had hand surgery, so he's probably going to be out, I don't remember the exact timeline, 4 or 5 months. So it kind of makes sense to match Merab Dvalishvili up with Henry Cejudo in a potential number 1 contender fight. But if Aljo wins and then retires, you're going to, or not retires, if Aljo wins and then moves up to 45, I might have misspoken before, but moves up to 45 and vacates the belt, you're going to need a new title fight. And Sean O'Malley will have just lost to Aljamain Sterling. So honestly, I think what happens, okay, let's say the UFC does Aljamain Sterling, Sean O'Malley, Aljamain Sterling wins, which is what my early prediction is. And then Aljamain Sterling sticks off of what he said. He's going to drop the belt and move up to 45. Give Merab a shot at that 145 or that 135 belt because he is the number 1 contender, kind of just waiting around at this point. I think what the UFC does, they're going to punish Henry Cejudo. They're not going to let him fight Merab because then Merab would be fighting for the vacant belt. I think the UFC will book, if Umar Nurmagomedov beats Corey Sandhagen, I think the UFC will book Merab Dvalishvili versus Umar Nurmagomedov for the vacant bantamweight title. And also, if Corey Sandhagen wins, I think they will book Merab Dvalishvili versus Corey Sandhagen for the vacant bantamweight title. I think they're going to let Henry Cejudo, they're going to make him fight up the ladder. I think they're going to make him at least fight 1 or 2 more fights, which, I mean, at this point, and I did a video on this as well, I think Henry Cejudo's career is basically over. He ruined his career by sitting out for 3 years. So I do believe, even though there's a lot of moving pieces, and of course, if Sean O'Malley wins, I don't know where the UFC is going to go from there. I don't think they're giving Aljamain Sterling a rematch if Sean O'Malley wins. Even if he wins in brutal robbery fashion, the UFC hates Aljamain Sterling. They are definitely going to try to have Sean O'Malley fight someone else. I don't know who it's going to be because I just have a hard time imagining the UFC attempting to do Sean O'Malley versus Merab Dvalishvili. I mean, I just can't imagine the UFC wanting to make that fight, so they probably try to find something else. Maybe give Song Yudong, if he beats Rob Font, a fight against Sean O'Malley for the title. I don't know what may go on in that situation. But now we're getting into the weeds a bit. We're talking about so many different hypotheticals. But ultimately, Aljamain Sterling beats Sean O'Malley. He vacates the belt, moves up to 145. Winner of Corey Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov versus Merab Dvalishvili for the vacant title by the end of 2023. That's what I believe happens. Now, as far as the rest of the division, Henry Cejudo, who knows who he's going to end up fighting? there's a lot of moving pieces. If that does in fact happen, he'll end up fighting, another loser somewhere along the line, or just somebody in the UFC. It all depends. There's so many fights coming up. It all depends how that plays out. But I do believe ultimately we will get Petr Yan versus Marlon Vera. That is an early prediction of mine. I believe that fight gets made. Now, one last thing I want to talk about is I believe there is another high-profile fight coming up in July on a massive UFC pay-per-view card that will be canceled very, very shortly. And I've said this from the jump. From the second I talked about it in a certain video I did maybe a month ago, 2 months ago at this point, I don't remember. I called it from the very beginning. There's still no information on it being canceled, but I believe with, I would say 99% certainty that it will be canceled. And that is Paulo Costa versus Aliskerov. That was announced. That's going to be on UFC 291. I can't remember. I think it might be the featured fight on the card. That is a massive middleweight matchup. I don't believe it's happening. I think the UFC announced that fight. I think they're trying to punish Paulo Costa. He's been kind of, difficult to negotiate with. They said he signed a new deal, but then he came out and said, I didn't sign a new deal. And there's been multiple fight announcements where he was supposed to fight Robert Whittaker. It didn't ultimately happen. I have a hard time believing, since the second it was announced, I have a hard time believing that Paulo Costa versus Aliskerov is going to happen at UFC 291. So that is the fight that I believe is canceled. I will honestly be shocked if that fight ultimately happens at the end of July. And honestly, the more I start to think about this Paulo Costa situation, the more I think he's either going to end up getting iced on the sidelines, or the more I think the UFC may just outright release him from his contract. And they're going to say, look, he's more trouble than he's worth. He hasn't won a fight. And Dana White will immediately go to discredit him and say, oh, he hasn't beat these guys, or hasn't won this, hasn't beat anyone in the rankings. Or Paulo Costa, you start looking over his resume, you can really start to delegitimize him easily. And the more I start thinking of this situation, I feel like that's going to come to a head at some point in the next few months. If Paulo Costa versus Aliskerov does not happen, I think we're going to see something go on between the UFC and Paulo Costa, because I'm still not even sure he signed a bout agreement. I think the UFC announced this fight prematurely to, again, put pressure on Paulo Costa, and I'm not sure he even signed a new contract. He came out and said, I signed a new contract, or they came out and said he signed a new contract. It was reported, and then all of a sudden, it was no longer, it was like he came out and said, I didn't sign a new contract just yet, or he said it on MMA Hour. I can't remember exactly where he said it. So we're not even sure he signed a new contract, let alone a bout agreement to fight an unranked contender who has one fight in the UFC. I just don't buy that it's going to happen. I have a hard time believing that Paulo Costa versus Aliskerov will happen at UFC 291. So just remember, you heard it here first. That fight is not happening. Let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. Who do you want to see Henry Cejudo fight? How do you feel about the UFC attempting to bully fighters into taking fights when they're injured, and the fact that the UFC doesn't care about having fighters at as close to 100% health as possible when they step in the cage? I would love to know your opinion. Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.